It's always been an auspicious prospect for most children. A new house means new neighbours, a new yard, new friends, and a new school. A new house for a boy of 9 means a new adventure. Well, at least until one has settled in. My parents and I decided to move due to a few contentious issues that had arisen in our previous town. More precisely, I'd begun to fight with the other children. Each time I'd be sent to detention, my parents would then be called, and I'd give a disingenuous excuse as to why I'd started it in the first place. Every time was akin to acting out a scene from a script. Each line would be repeated on cue, and each time I'd be grounded accordingly. I must concede that at the time I had no real reason for my behaviour. At least, nothing beyond acting out for attention. Back then, I was merely a child yearning for more attention from my overworked parents. I knew no better. Unfortunately for me, the doctor my parents took me to believed he had an answer to my desperate behaviour. ADHD, or better known as attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or so the man explained. I was then prescribed pills, which I had to take each morning before school. I ceased fighting and often slept during class, but my parents were grateful that they made looking after me a bit less arduous. Nevertheless, I'd already developed a reputation with the other parents and was therefore banned from everyone's house. In other words, I had no friends anymore. I don't think that this particular reason was behind my parents' decision to move, but it was my best guess at the time. My parents were middle-class workers and therefore frugal when choosing the house. It was located out in the country with a rather luscious lawn, almost endemic to the yard. The house itself was allocated in the centre of this emerald grassland. Clearly it needed yard work, but to me, it was a jungle of opportunities. I remember spending that first day hunting down insects and lizards, as well as any other creature I'd notice, during my cursory scan of the overgrown yard. The house itself was quaint and had no basement. Our beds didn't arrive for a few days, so until then, I slept in my parents' room. I must admit, I missed those innocuous nights. They were the only calm ones I had back then. It wasn't until a few nights after my bed arrived that I noticed the erratic sounds. They began quietly at first, and I was able to ignore it for the time being. I imagined it to be some creature living within the walls, perhaps a lizard or a squirrel. However, it didn't take long for them to become difficult to ignore. The sounds became thumps, and on occasion, I could swear I heard someone mumbling. With no reason to believe any different, I continued to ignore them, up until the footsteps. At this point, my room was still empty, beyond the single twin-sized bed, the head of which leaned against the wall. The source of the steps seemed to originate at the far wall opposite of me. I remember huddling in my bed, uncertain of how I should handle it. The footsteps were getting closer and seemed to be directed towards me, yet no other being was revealed as the culprit. The thought of this invisible entity somehow taking hold of me was enough to find my voice. The sounds stopped as soon as my parents burst into the room. I promptly explained the noises and was about to mention the footsteps before they interrupted me. They blamed it on my lavish imagination, said it was all in my head, and repeated this in order to lull me into a sense of security. As a child, I took their words to heart and let their explanations cocoon me in a blanket of ignorance. I didn't hear the sounds again that night, or for the next few nights, and by the first day of school, I chalked it up to a bad dream. I promptly took my morning pill and made my way to the bus stop. At the corner, by the end of the road, I met my first friend, Tommy Sears. He was cool and welcomed me to the neighbourhood. We sat next to each other on the bus and he introduced me to a few other kids. All in all, it was a great first day. Once I got dropped off, I asked where he lived in case we'd be able to play over the weekend. He pointed up the road, to the right of where my new house was. His home was at least a mile away from my own, the view barred by the scattered plots of trees that littered the pastures and valleys. I should probably explain that the neighbourhood wasn't very close-knit. Each house was a mile or so apart and obscured by farms, trees and pasture. His particular house was also hidden by a wall of forested patches. We said our goodbyes and I mentioned my new friend to my parents, who approved of my new social life. By that night, I felt none of my inane fear from before. That didn't last long. The sounds started again, this time more prominent. The murmurs, though indecipherable, were louder. They fell silent once the thumping began. At first, it had a rhythm that slowly arose into a cacophony of muted noise. Eventually, the footsteps started again, once more directed towards me. The joys of the day drained from my conscious mind as fear overtook me. I tried to remember what my parents convinced me of, that this was all simply part of my vivid imagination. However, that didn't work for long, when a blood-curdling scream pierced the darkness. I, in turn, screamed in unison, once more calling my parents. Silence fell. It was as though my parents' presence was enough to scare whatever it was away. I was explicit this time, recounting every sound I'd heard since the first night. However, my insufferable parents refused to listen. Once more, they tried to coo lies of ignorance. Once more, they ignored my pleas. It turned into an argument. Eventually, they threatened to ground me and left me alone in the darkness of my room. It was at that moment I had an epiphany. My parents couldn't help me. No,